If you walk into any modern contemporary garden center today, you will be immediately struck by the overwhelming dominance of a single powerful word: organic. Our modern gardening culture is deeply, almost obsessively, fixated on the concept of natural harmony. We meticulously study the delicate balance of the soil microbiome. We purchase expensive heirloom seeds. We cultivate rich, dark compost in our backyards. And we recoil in absolute visceral horror at the mere suggestion of spraying synthetic pesticides on the vegetables we intend to feed our families. We view nature as a fragile, beautiful partner that must be respected, nurtured, and gently coaxed into providing a harvest. But to truly understand the mindset of the 1950s suburban gardener, you must take this modern philosophy of environmental harmony, tear it to shreds, and burn it to the ground. When we look back at the mid-century American backyard, we are not looking at a place of peaceful coexistence with nature. We are looking at a localized, highly toxic theater of war. The 1950s approach to agriculture, even on the smallest domestic scale, was driven by an absolute, unwavering, and utterly blind faith in the miraculous power of modern industrial chemistry. To comprehend how this incredibly dangerous mindset became the normalized standard for millions of average families, we have to look at the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. During the global conflict, the American chemical industry had expanded at an unprecedented, explosive rate. Massive factories and sprawling industrial complexes were constructed specifically to synthesize chemical warfare agents, powerful defoliants to clear jungles, high-yield synthetic nitrates for bombs and artillery shells, and highly toxic insect repellents to protect soldiers fighting in malaria-infested tropical theaters. When the war finally ended in 1945, these massive chemical corporations faced a sudden, terrifying existential crisis. They possessed enormous factories, thousands of chemists, and an incredible capacity to produce toxic compounds. But their primary customer, the United States military, was aggressively canceling contracts. These corporations desperately needed a new, vast, and highly profitable market for their chemical arsenals. They found that market in the booming, rapidly expanding, and beautifully manicured backyards of the new American suburbs. The chemicals of war were systematically, brilliantly rebranded as the chemicals of peace. The marketing campaigns launched during this era were nothing short of psychological masterpieces. They capitalized on the intense, post-war optimism of the American public. The men who returned from the war had just conquered the Axis powers through superior technology, heavy industry, and overwhelming force. They returned to the suburbs with a deep, ingrained belief that American science was invincible. If human ingenuity and industrial might could split the atom and defeat global tyranny, then surely it could completely eradicate the annoyance of a tomato hornworm or a patch of crabgrass. Advertising in magazines like Better Homes and Gardens and Popular Mechanics featured smiling, authoritative men in crisp white laboratory coats holding glass beakers, promising a utopian, bug-free, weed-free paradise. The slogan, "Better Living Through Chemistry," famously popularized by DuPont, was not just a corporate catchphrase. It was accepted by the general public as a profound, undeniable scientific truth. In this mid-century psychological framework, nature was not viewed as a fragile partner. Nature was viewed as a chaotic, messy, and fundamentally inefficient enemy that needed to be violently subdued and brought to heel. Insects, weeds, and soil diseases were not seen as part of a natural ecosystem. They were invading forces, trespassing on private suburban property, and they had to be annihilated using the most powerful weapons available at the local hardware store. The 1950s, father did not want to work with his garden. He wanted to dominate it. He wanted absolute, total control over his property, and the chemical companies handed him the weapons to achieve that domination for just a few dollars a bottle. Welcome back to Vanished Americana. In this incredibly dark, eye-opening investigation, we are going to dig beneath the pristine, perfect surface of the 1950s suburban lawn. We are going to expose the toxic, highly dangerous reality of how our grandparents actually achieved those magazine-perfect gardens. We will look at the lethal poisons that were sold over the counter without a single warning label, the shocking ways they were applied, and the terrifying chemical legacy that is still buried in our soil today. If you appreciate documentaries that strip away the nostalgic gloss and reveal the hard, unfiltered truth of our history, please take a moment right now to subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and leave a comment. Your engagement tells the algorithm that real history matters, and it helps us keep this archive alive. Now, put on your protective gear because we are stepping into the toxic fog of the mid-century harvest. If there is a single defining chemical compound that perfectly encapsulates the terrifying hubris and the absolute unquestioning trust of the 1950s, it is dichlorodiphenyl-trichloroethane. We know it simply and infamously as DDT. Today, the mere mention of DDT evokes images of environmental devastation, the near extinction of the bald eagle, and massive global bans on its production. We recognize it as one of the most environmentally catastrophic synthetic pesticides ever unleashed upon the planet. But in the 1950s, DDT was not viewed as a poison. It was universally celebrated as a literal, unmitigated miracle of modern science. During World War II, DDT was deployed aggressively by the military to clear Pacific islands of malaria, carrying mosquitoes, and to dust the bodies of soldiers and refugees in Europe to prevent devastating outbreaks of typhus. It was incredibly effective, saving hundreds of thousands of lives during the conflict. Because of its heroic wartime record, when DDT was finally released for commercial domestic use in the late 1940s and early 1950s, it arrived in the American suburbs with an unimpeachable golden reputation. It was hailed by newspapers, politicians, and scientists as the ultimate savior of humanity, the chemical that would finally rid the world of pestilence and insect-borne disease forever. This absolute blind trust translated into a level of casual domestic usage that is genuinely horrifying to look back on today. Because the government and the chemical manufacturers assured the public that DDT was completely harmless to humans and mammals, the concept of basic safety precautions simply did not exist. There were no hazardous material suits, no heavy rubber gloves, and certainly no respiratory masks. A typical 1950s grandfather, determined to protect his prized backyard tomato plants from aphids and caterpillars, would walk out to the garden on a hot Saturday afternoon, wearing nothing but a short-sleeved cotton shirt and a pair of canvas trousers. He would load a heavy, concentrated dose of pure DDT powder into a hand-pumped metal flit gun, a device that resembled a large bicycle pump. With a cigarette casually dangling from his lips, he would pump the handle, blasting thick, heavy white clouds of concentrated neurotoxin directly onto the leaves of his vegetables. The fine, toxic white dust would settle on the tomatoes, on the soil, on his bare arms, and he would inevitably inhale a significant portion of the chemical cloud with every breath. He didn't flinch, he didn't worry, and he didn't wash it off immediately, because he fundamentally believed he was doing something modern, sanitary, and profoundly beneficial for his family's food supply. But the domestic application of DDT was not limited to the hand pump. It was deployed on a massive municipal scale that created some of the most surreal and disturbing imagery of the 20th century. Local town councils and suburban municipalities, eager to eradicate the annoyance of summer mosquitoes, purchased massive truck-mounted chemical fogging machines. During the long, humid evenings of July and August, these heavy trucks would slowly cruise down the residential streets of idyllic post-war neighborhoods, loudly pumping out incredibly dense, thick, billowing white clouds of DDT heavily mixed with fuel oil. The sheer volume of the chemical fog was staggering. It would completely obscure the houses, the parked cars, and the streetlights in a suffocating, sweet-smelling whiteout. And here is the detail that truly separates the psychology of the 1950s from our modern reality. When the DDT fogging truck came down the street, parents did not rush their children inside, lock the doors, and close the windows. They did the exact opposite. Children in the 1950s actively chased the fogging trucks. It was treated as a neighborhood event, a magical summertime game. Dozens of kids dressed in shorts and t-shirts would run laughing and screaming directly behind the exhaust pipes of the trucks, literally playing hide and seek inside a dense, concentrated cloud of synthetic chemical neurotoxins. They would ride their bicycles through the fog, breathing heavily, their skin and hair completely coated in the oily, toxic residue. Mothers would stand on their front porches, breathing the same air, pleased that they wouldn't have to deal with mosquito bites that evening. The absolute suspension of basic survival instinct, the complete override of the natural human reaction to avoid thick, choking chemical smoke, is a testament to the terrifying power of corporate marketing and blind trust in authority. If you were a child in the 1950s or 60s and you actually remember running behind the DDT trucks on a summer night, I need you to leave a comment right now. Tell the younger generation what it smelled like, what it felt like, because they simply cannot believe that this actually happened. Your memories are the primary historical documents we need to prove this reality. While the newly synthesized miracle compounds like DDT represented the cutting edge of post-war chemical optimism, the 1950s garden shed was also heavily stocked with older, darker, and significantly more lethal substances. The belief that more chemistry is better chemistry meant that gardeners did not simply replace their old poisons when new ones arrived. They simply added them to their arsenal, creating a staggering, terrifying cocktail of toxicity within the confines of a suburban garage. Today, we understand the devastating, irreversible neurological damage caused by heavy metals. We have spent decades aggressively banning lead from our paint, removing it from our gasoline, and strictly regulating the disposal of anything containing arsenic. But in the mid-century domestic environment, these highly dangerous elemental poisons were treated with the exact same casual indifference as a bag of potting soil or a handful of grass seed. The undisputed king of this older class of poisons was lead arsenate. Before the invention of complex synthetic organics, lead arsenate was the primary weapon used by agricultural industries to combat chewing insects, particularly in apple orchards and on fruit-bearing vines. Despite the fact that it is an incredibly toxic inorganic compound, combining the heavy metal poisoning of lead with the lethal toxicity of arsenic, it was sold freely and casually in local hardware stores right next to the rakes and the garden hoses. It typically came in the form of a dense, heavy, chalky white or slightly pink powder packaged in simple cardboard boxes or thin paper sacks that were highly susceptible to tearing and moisture. There were absolutely no child-proof safety caps, no heavy plastic tamper-evident seals, and very rarely were there any serious alarming warning labels that conveyed the true lethality of the substance within. The casual handling of these heavy metal poisons by the 1950s homeowner is deeply unnerving to examine. To apply lead arsenate to the garden, a father would take a heavy galvanized tin bucket, very often the exact same unwashed bucket he had used the previous weekend to wash the family Chevrolet, or the bucket the children used to play with water in the backyard. He would tear open the paper sack of lead arsenate, completely unprotected from the fine, toxic dust that puffed into the air, and dump a massive, unmeasured scoop of the heavy metal powder directly into the bucket. He would then add water from the garden hose and, lacking any specialized mixing equipment, he would simply stir the lethal slurry with his bare hands or a random stick picked up from the lawn. He would then walk through his backyard using a coarse brush or a primitive pump, splashing this highly concentrated mixture of lead and arsenic directly onto the leaves of his fruit trees, his rose bushes, and the soil surrounding his vegetable beds. The storage of these chemicals was equally terrifying. Because there was no cultural concept of hazardous domestic waste, the garden shed or the back corner of the garage became a highly unstable, unregulated toxic dumping ground. Heavy glass jars of nicotine sulfate, a poison so strong that a few drops on the skin could be fatal, sat precariously on rickety wooden shelves. Rusted, leaking metal tins containing chlordane, malathion, and various derivatives of strychnine were casually shoved into the dark corners. And the most horrifying aspect of this reality is the proximity to domestic life. These unsealed, highly lethal powders and liquids were stored on the lowest shelves, literally inches away from the children's bicycles. The jump ropes, the father's woodworking tools, and the family dog's sleeping blanket. A single spilled jar or a curious toddler exploring the garage could have resulted in an instant horrific tragedy. Furthermore, unlike the modern synthetic chemicals that eventually break down under sunlight and rain, heavy metals like lead and arsenic never disappear. They do not degrade. They simply sink into the earth and remain there permanently. The relentless year-after-year application of lead arsenate by well-meaning 1950s fathers means that the soil in many of those beautiful historic suburban neighborhoods is still highly contaminated today, carrying a toxic, invisible legacy that will outlast the houses themselves. We romanticize the innocence of the 1950s suburban childhood, but we conveniently forget that they were playing in the dirt of a highly unregulated chemical waste site. To fully understand the motivation behind this relentless chemical warfare, we must look at the ultimate prize, the undisputed status symbol, and the absolute obsession of the 1950s suburban gardener: the perfect, unblemished, massive backyard tomato. In the mid-century neighborhood, the quality of a man's front lawn indicated his civic obedience, but the quality of his backyard tomato harvest indicated his true mastery over his domain. A sprawling, heavily laden tomato vine producing giant, bright red, flawless fruit was a profound point of masculine pride, a physical trophy that could be sliced and served at neighborhood barbecues to assert dominance over the man living next door. However, as any experienced gardener knows, nature is inherently messy. Cultivating tomatoes organically is a constant, frustrating battle against blight, fungus, hornworms, unpredictable weather, and uneven growth. The 1950s father, completely unwilling to accept defeat or imperfection, decided that if nature would not cooperate, nature would be battered into submission through the aggressive, overwhelming application of chemical science. The assault began at the very roots of the plant. Today, organic gardeners carefully build their soil structure over years using rich, dark compost, aged manure, and natural microbial inoculants. In the 1950s, patience was not on the agenda. They wanted immediate, explosive, unnatural growth. To achieve this, they relied on the newly available, highly concentrated synthetic fertilizers. These fertilizers were essentially chemical salts, heavily derived from the exact same industrial processes used to manufacture high explosives during the war. They were incredibly high in synthetic nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. A father would take a scoop of these neon blue or harsh crystalline white chemical salts and pour them directly onto the bare dirt around the base of the tomato seedlings. The reaction was almost violent. The massive influx of artificial nitrogen forced the plant into a state of rapid, unnatural, hyper-accelerated growth. The vines shot up quickly, producing massive, incredibly dark green leaves. But this explosive, forced growth came at a hidden cost. It made the plant physically weaker, deeply dependent on the chemical inputs, and incredibly attractive to every single pest in the neighborhood. When the inevitable invasion of insects arrived, drawn by the artificially bloated nitrogen-heavy plants, the second phase of the chemical assault was unleashed. If a modern gardener spots a massive, terrifying green tomato hornworm chewing on a leaf, the standard procedure is to put on a pair of gloves, physically pick the massive caterpillar off the vine, and throw it into a bucket of soapy water. It is a gross, tedious, but entirely safe and highly effective method. The 1950s, gardener had no interest in tedious manual labor. When a hornworm or a cluster of aphids was spotted, the immediate response was total chemical annihilation. The father would return to the garage, mix a heavy concentrated batch of liquid malathion, chlordane, or lindane, powerful broad-spectrum neurotoxins that killed absolutely everything they touched, and thoroughly douse the entire plant until it was dripping with toxic liquid. He didn't just target the bugs, he engaged in preventative scorched earth spraying, poisoning the leaves, the stems, the flowers, and the developing fruit itself, ensuring that no insect would ever dare land on his prized crop. The ultimate, deeply ironic result of this chemical gauntlet was the harvest itself. By late August, the father would proudly walk into the kitchen carrying a massive basket of giant, flawless, perfectly red tomatoes. There was not a single insect bite on them. There was no blight. They looked like they had been manufactured in a factory, because in many ways they had been. but they were fundamentally grown in a highly toxic soup. The mother of the house, entirely trusting the process and completely unaware of the chemical reality, would take these massive tomatoes to the kitchen sink. She would run them under the cold tap water, gently wiping the skin with a towel, believing she was washing away the dirt of a wholesome, healthy, natural garden. But you cannot simply wash away systemic pesticides. The heavy synthetic fertilizers and the persistent chemical toxins had been drawn up through the roots, absorbed by the leaves, and incorporated into the very cellular structure of the fruit itself. The family would sit around the dinner table, eating a beautiful bright red, homegrown summer salad, completely oblivious to the fact that they were consuming a triumph of industrial chemistry, a silent cocktail of neurotoxins served on a pristine ceramic plate. The 1950s garden was not a return to nature. It was the ultimate terrifying illusion of control. While the backyard vegetable garden was the primary battleground for insecticides and heavy metal poisons, the front lawn represented a completely different but equally toxic theater of the mid-century suburban war. Today, we view the lawn as a simple aesthetic choice, a place for children to play, or perhaps a minor weekend chore. But in the 1950s, the front lawn was not merely grass. It was a profound, highly visible projection of a man's civic duty, his moral character, and his financial stability. In the tightly packed, heavily conformist landscape of post-war developments like Levittown, where the houses were architecturally identical, the quality of your front lawn was the only acceptable way to differentiate yourself from your neighbors. A perfectly uniform, fiercely green, immaculately trimmed carpet of grass demonstrated that you were a hard-working, responsible, and patriotic American. Conversely, a lawn marred by a single yellow dandelion, a patch of crabgrass, or a stray clump of clover was not viewed as a simple landscaping oversight. It was perceived as a public declaration of laziness, a lack of community spirit, and a direct insult to the neighborhood's property values. The pressure to maintain this emerald illusion was absolute, suffocating, and relentless. Before the chemical revolution of the 1950s, maintaining a pristine monoculture lawn, meaning a lawn consisting of only one single species of grass with absolutely zero other plant life, was a virtually impossible task that required agonizing, bone-crushing physical labor. Fathers and housewives would spend their entire weekends crawling on their hands and knees across the grass, armed with specialized metal claw tools, physically digging deep into the soil to extract the taproots of dandelions one by one. It was a never-ending, exhausting, and deeply frustrating war of attrition against nature. However, the post-war chemical industry once again arrived to offer a miraculous, effortless solution. The weapon they delivered was 2,4-D, an incredibly powerful synthetic broadleaf herbicide that had been developed during World War II with the initial intent of destroying enemy crop yields. When applied to a suburban lawn, 2,4-D possessed a terrifying, almost magical capability. It would aggressively attack and chemically annihilate any broadleaf plant, like dandelions, plantains, or thistles, while leaving the narrow blades of the turfgrass completely unharmed. The introduction of 2,4-D fundamentally altered the ecology of the American suburb and forever changed our definition of a perfect lawn. Prior to the 1950s, clover was actually considered an essential, highly desirable component of a healthy lawn. Seed companies intentionally mixed clover seeds into their grass blends because clover is a natural nitrogen fixer. It pulls nitrogen from the air and feeds it directly into the soil, keeping the grass green naturally and eliminating the need for synthetic fertilizers. Clover was beautiful, soft, and beneficial. But there was one massive problem for the chemical companies. 2,4-D could not distinguish between a dandelion and a clover plant. The chemical killed them both with equal prejudice. Therefore, in one of the most brilliant and devastating marketing campaigns in history, the chemical industry simply rebranded clover. They launched massive advertising blitzes declaring that clover was no longer a beneficial companion plant. It was a noxious, ugly weed that ruined the uniformity of the modern lawn. Within a single decade, the American public was completely brainwashed into hating a plant that had naturally fertilized their soil for centuries, simply because the new miracle chemicals happened to kill it. Armed with metal watering cans and hose-end sprayers, the men of the 1950s eagerly embraced their new role as chemical eradicators. On a typical Saturday morning, the air in a suburban neighborhood would be thick with the sharp, acrid, unmistakably chemical stench of 2,4-D evaporating in the summer sun. Men would casually spray hundreds of gallons of this powerful herbicide mere feet from open living room windows, completely unconcerned about the toxic mist drifting onto their porches, their children's toys, and their own skin. They were no longer gardeners. They were the absolute, undisputed masters of their domain, capable of destroying undesirable life with the simple pull of a trigger. They achieved the impossible, flawless emerald carpet that the magazines promised, but they did it by transforming their front yards into sterile, chemically dependent environments. The natural resilience of the soil was destroyed, requiring ever-increasing applications of synthetic fertilizers to keep the grass green, which in turn invited more pests, creating an endless, highly profitable cycle of chemical dependency. If you look at an old family photograph from the 1950s and see a perfectly uniform, weed-free lawn, you are not looking at a triumph of nature. You are looking at a highly toxic chemical achievement. If you remember the intense neighborhood pressure to keep the lawn perfect, please share your stories in the comments below. We need to document the psychological toll of this mid-century obsession. The sheer volume of lethal neurotoxins and heavy metals poured onto the soil of the 1950s suburbs is shocking. But what is truly incomprehensible to the modern mind is the absolute terrifying casualness with which these chemicals were handled in the domestic environment. Today, if a professional landscaping company arrives to spray a residential lawn with commercial-grade pesticides, the workers are mandated by federal law to wear heavy rubber boots, chemical-resistant coveralls, thick neoprene gloves, and industrial respiratory masks. They place small yellow warning flags across the grass, legally advising residents and pets to stay off the contaminated area for at least 24 to 48 hours. We understand that these chemicals are dangerous, and we treat them with the extreme caution they demand. But in the 1950s, the concept of personal protective equipment for gardening was considered utterly ridiculous. The chemical corporations, deeply invested in maintaining the illusion that their products were friendly, modern, and completely harmless, aggressively marketed these poisons as safe enough to use around infants and household pets. This corporate deception led to practices that border on the surreal. The 1950s homeowner did not possess specialized, dedicated equipment for handling toxic waste. When a father needed to mix a lethal batch of chlordane or liquid malathion to eradicate a nest of ants or a swarm of beetles, he used whatever was immediately available in the garage. He would frequently use the exact same galvanized metal watering can that his wife used to water her prize-winning indoor African violets. He would pour the concentrated, highly toxic liquid into the can, mix it with water from the hose, and stir the lethal concoction with his bare, unprotected hands, perhaps using a broken yardstick. There were no measuring cups. The philosophy was almost universally, if a little bit is good, a lot is much better. The chemical would splash onto his skin, soak into his canvas sneakers, and inevitably leave a heavy toxic residue inside the watering can, which would later be brought back inside the family home. The absolute lack of caution extended directly to the children playing in these chemically drenched environments. The post-war suburb was teeming with young baby boomers, and the backyard was their primary universe. It was incredibly common for a father to thoroughly douse the front lawn with a heavy application of 2,4-D herbicide, and mere minutes later, his children would be running barefoot across the wet, chemically treated grass, playing tag or running through a lawn sprinkler. The toxic residue would coat the soles of their bare feet. It would transfer to their hands as they played in the dirt, and it would inevitably be tracked directly onto the living room carpets and the kitchen linoleum. Mothers, completely trusting the advertising claims that these modern miracles were safe, did not panic. They did not scrub their children with harsh soap or rush them to the doctor. The sharp chemical smell of pesticides wafting through the neighborhood on a Saturday afternoon was simply accepted as the modern scent of a clean, well-maintained, and successful American suburb. This blind trust was reinforced by incredibly deceptive and often criminally negligent packaging and advertising. Insecticides containing highly potent neurotoxins were sold in brightly colored tin cans with cheerful, cartoonish illustrations of dead bugs, looking more like a can of household floor wax or car polish than a lethal weapon. The warning labels, if they existed at all, were printed in microscopic text on the back of the can, usually offering incredibly mild advice like avoid prolonged contact with skin or wash hands after use. There was absolutely no mention of long-term neurological damage, the catastrophic risks of inhaling the vaporized chemicals, or the fact that these compounds could easily accumulate in human fatty tissues over time. The American consumer was actively participating in a massive, uncontrolled, nationwide chemical experiment entirely funded by their own desire to achieve the perfect magazine-ready garden. They were systematically poisoning their own sanctuaries, fully believing they were protecting their families. We look back and judge them for their ignorance, but we must ask ourselves, if the most trusted scientific authorities and the largest corporations in the world told you a product was a miracle, wouldn't you believe them too? If this deep dive into the hidden dangers of the past is opening your eyes to the truth of the 1950s, please make sure you are subscribed to Vanished Americana and hit that like button to help us expose more forgotten history. The devastating consequences of this relentless, unregulated chemical warfare could not remain hidden forever. While the 1950s father was celebrating his massive, blemish-free tomatoes and his impeccably uniform, weed-free emerald lawn, a profound and deeply disturbing silence was beginning to descend upon the American suburb. The ecosystem, subjected to an unprecedented barrage of synthetic neurotoxins, heavy metals, and broad-spectrum herbicides, was quietly collapsing. The chemical corporations had promised that their miracle products would target only the specific pests that ruined the aesthetic perfection of the garden. They promised a surgical strike against the hornworm, the aphid, and the dandelion. But nature does not operate in a vacuum, and poisons do not discriminate. The chemicals applied to the suburban backyard were weapons of mass ecological destruction, and the collateral damage was staggering, heartbreaking, and entirely ignored by the general public for over a decade. The first, most immediate casualties were the beneficial insects that actually maintained the health of the environment. When a homeowner blanketed their garden in a heavy fog of DDT or malathion to kill a small colony of aphids, they simultaneously annihilated the entire local population of bees, butterflies, ladybugs, and praying mantises. These were the essential pollinators and the natural biological predators that kept the ecosystem in balance. Without the bees, the fruit trees in the neighborhood suddenly stopped producing apples and cherries. Without the ladybugs, the aphids, which reproduced significantly faster than their predators, would return to the garden in massive, uncontrollable swarms just a few weeks after the chemical spray dissipated. This created a vicious, incredibly profitable cycle of dependency. Because the natural predators were dead, the gardener was forced to buy and apply even more powerful, more toxic chemicals to control the resulting population explosion of pests. The suburban yard had been transformed into a sterile, artificial environment that could only be maintained through constant chemical intervention. But the devastation extended far beyond the insect world, reaching deep into the soil and high into the trees. Earthworms, the vital engineers of the soil that aerate the earth and break down organic matter, absorbed massive quantities of the heavy metals and persistent neurotoxins applied to the lawns. The chemicals did not immediately kill the worms. Instead, the toxins accumulated in their fatty tissues in highly concentrated doses. When the spring rains arrived, drawing the earthworms to the surface of the manicured lawns, the American robin and other beloved songbirds would descend to feast. A single robin consuming a diet of these chemically loaded earthworms would quickly ingest a lethal dose of DDT or chlordane. Throughout the late 1950s and early 1960s, a horrifying phenomenon became increasingly common in pristine suburban neighborhoods. Homeowners would walk out to their perfect lawns in the morning and find dozens of dead or violently trembling songbirds scattered across the grass, their nervous systems completely destroyed by the invisible poisons they had unknowingly consumed. This creeping, undeniable ecological catastrophe eventually culminated in 1962 with the publication of Rachel Carson's groundbreaking, world-changing book, Silent Spring. Carson bravely and meticulously documented the horrific, widespread destruction caused by the indiscriminate use of synthetic pesticides. She painted a chilling, apocalyptic picture of a future where the American spring arrived without the singing of birds, the buzzing of bees, or the flickering of fireflies, a silence brought about entirely by our own arrogant desire to control nature. The chemical industry fiercely attacked Carson, launching massive, well-funded smear campaigns to discredit her science and label her an alarmist. But the damage to the corporate illusion was done. The American public, looking out their picture windows at their sterile, silent, perfectly green lawns, finally began to realize the terrifying cost of their mid-century utopia. The perfect tomato and the weed-free grass were not miracles of modern science. They were the spoils of a devastating war against the very environment that sustained them. If you have noticed the disappearance of fireflies or songbirds in your own lifetime, please leave a comment below. It is a vital reminder that the echoes of this chemical war are still being felt today. As we look back at the terrifying reality of the 1950s suburban garden, it is tempting to view it as a closed, safely concluded chapter of American history. We comfort ourselves with the knowledge that DDT was officially banned in the United States in 1972, that lead arsenate was pulled from the market, and that the blatantly deceptive advertising campaigns of the mid-century chemical corporations are no longer legal. We look at our modern organic gardening centers, our raised beds filled with specialized compost, and our strict environmental regulations, and we proudly assume that we have completely moved past the toxic ignorance of our grandparents. We believe that the chemical utopia of the 1950s is nothing more than a disturbing ghost story. But this assumption is not just incorrect, it is a dangerous illusion. The terrifying truth is that the history of the 1950s garden is not gone. It is quite literally buried right beneath our feet. The synthetic neurotoxins and, more importantly, the heavy elemental metals like lead and arsenic that were poured so casually by the gallon onto the mid-century lawns do not simply evaporate. They do not magically degrade, they do not wash away into the ocean, and they do not disappear with the passage of time. They are fundamentally permanent, because the 1950s father believed that more is better. The sheer concentration of these highly toxic elements in the soil of historic, highly sought-after suburban neighborhoods is often astronomically high. This creates a profound, incredibly tragic irony in our modern culture. Today, a young, environmentally conscious family might purchase a beautiful, historic mid-century home. Eager to live a healthy, sustainable lifestyle, they will tear up a section of the backyard lawn to build an organic vegetable garden. They will plant heirloom tomatoes, delicate leafy greens, and root vegetables, completely unaware that they are plunging their hands and their food into the exact same soil that was heavily saturated with lead arsenate and chlordane 70 years ago. When they harvest their organic carrots and radishes, they may unknowingly be pulling up the highly toxic, invisible legacy of the 1950s obsession with the perfect garden. This hidden danger is exactly why modern environmental experts and agricultural extensions now strongly advise anyone starting a vegetable garden in a historic residential neighborhood to have their soil thoroughly tested for heavy metals before planting a single seed. If the lead or arsenic levels are too high, the only safe option is to completely abandon the native earth, build elevated, sealed raised beds, and purchase completely new, uncontaminated soil brought in from outside sources. We are literally forced to build protective barriers against the actions of our own grandparents. The men and women of the 1950s were not malicious. They were simply operating under a powerful, beautifully marketed illusion. They genuinely believed they were conquering nature to provide a safer, cleaner, and more abundant life for their children. They could not have possibly comprehended that their pursuit of the flawless, blemish-free tomato would leave a toxic inheritance that would poison the earth for generations to come. The story of the 1950s garden is the ultimate cautionary tale about the terrifying danger of human hubris and the blind, unquestioning worship of industrial convenience. It teaches us that whenever we attempt to completely dominate the natural world, whenever we prioritize aesthetic perfection over ecological reality, nature will inevitably present us with a devastating long-term bill. Today, as we carefully cultivate our organic compost and accept the occasional blemish on our homegrown vegetables, we are not just practicing a new trend, we are actively trying to heal the deep, invisible scars left by the chemical wars of the past. Thank you for joining me on this intense, uncompromising journey through the shadows of vanished Americana. Documenting the unvarnished truth of our history requires an immense amount of research, and your direct support is the only thing that keeps this archive open. If this deep dive changed the way you look at your own backyard, please subscribe to the channel right now. Hit that like button and share this video with anyone who loves gardening or history. And before you leave, I want you to go down to the comments and tell me, have you ever had your backyard soil tested? Or do you remember the chemical smells of a mid-century summer? I read every single one of your stories. Until next time, respect the soil, question the chemicals, and remember that true perfection is found in nature, not in a bottle. See you in the next video.